Welcome to part one of Trico Charitable Foundation's Rethinking Social Entrepreneurship. I want to begin by giving a brief overview of Trico Charitable Foundation. Trico Charitable Foundation aims to close gaps in society through social entrepreneurship. And we do this and we build capacity in this space through a number of our programs. The first is the World of Social Entrepreneurship, which brings exciting examples of social entrepreneurship from across the world to Calgary. Next is Recode, which is all about nurturing the social entrepreneurship space within post-secondary institutions. The Social Enterprise is a biennial award that celebrates the best examples and the best practices in Canadian social enterprises. And finally, Assess. And this workshop is actually part of the Assess program, and it's really focused on building capacity in organizations around social entrepreneurship. So why rethinking social entrepreneurship? Well, we used to call this session Introduction to Social Entrepreneurship. However, we became increasingly concerned that the conversations that need to happen in the social entrepreneurship space were just not happening. And I do want to say that this isn't about us thinking that we have all the answers. While we're excited about the work that we do in this space and our learnings, we are in no way claiming to be experts. For us, it's more about us sharing what we've learned to facilitate the key questions that need to be discussed and the conversations that need to occur. Based on our work in this area, we believe that there are 4 key points to rethinking social entrepreneurship, and this series of presentations is going to tackle them. First, we think we need to move the discussion around social entrepreneurship from definition, what it is, to potential, what it can be. We think this move will have a number of profound ripples. The first being that moving to a discussion around potential will help us identify our North Star question, which is, how can we fully harness the power of business models to solve social problems? The next impact of moving to potential is that we will gain a deeper understanding of how to blend the social and entrepreneurial in order to fully live up to our North Star question. And finally, if we move from definition to potential and we have our North Star question, and if we better understand how the social and entrepreneurial can blend, this should usher in a new era of creativity and reimagining when it comes to social entrepreneurship. I'm going to begin this conversation with a move from definition to potential. And no surprise here, we're going to actually begin this conversation with a definition. So we get asked all the time, how do we define social entrepreneurship and what do we mean by it? And the reality is there's a number of ways that this term has been used. For us, we choose to use a wide tent or a broad definition. And we say that social entrepreneurship uses business models, selling products or services to solve social problems. And for the most part, this aligns with what you'll see in Canada. For example, about 10 years ago, the Canadian Task Force on Social Finance used a very similar definition. Social enterprise is defined as any organization or business that uses market-oriented production and sale of goods and services to pursue a public benefit mission. So very similar mentality behind each of these definitions. And I do want to point out one difference. We use the term social entrepreneurship and they use the term social enterprise. And this space can get complicated very, very quickly. So I just want to clarify that when I talk about social entrepreneurship, I'm talking about the activity. When I'm talking about a social entrepreneur, I'm talking about an individual. And when I talk about social enterprise, I'm talking about the venture itself. While we say that we aim to move the conversation from definition to potential, we're not saying that definition doesn't have its place. It does, and it can actually be quite helpful. However, we feel that it's usually the least exciting part of an idea, and we worry that the social enterprise space and conversation seems to be stuck in a bit of a definition rut. And I'm going to use an example to expand on this. So consider the definition of a car. Most of you are familiar with a car. You've either owned a car or you've at least been in a car. But I bet you haven't thought about what the definition is. And that just goes to show you that you can do great things with an idea without knowing the definition. Here's the definition of a car. It's a 4-wheeled road vehicle that is powered by an engine and is able to carry a small number of people. I want to note a couple of things about this definition. So first, this definition is accurate when you think of the first ever mass-produced car, and this is the Model F, and the picture includes Henry Ford, and it's still representative of today's high-end Lamborghini. However, the definition does not reflect the advancement and also the progress that has been made between these two cars. Look at how much has changed, and the definition in no way gets at that. The next thing is it doesn't get at where we're going. The definition does not identify or reflect the two most powerful game-changing conversations that are happening in this space, which is around autonomous vehicles and electric cars. It doesn't get at the ripples and the impacts that this change will have and this progress will have. Here's a quote from Steven Pinker, who actually identifies some of the ripples and the impacts that this will have on society. He says that it will save more than 1 million lives a year. The definition doesn't get at that. When you look at impacts and you talk about the ripples that it had, well, it doesn't talk about the impact of the vehicle. When it was first created, all of a sudden you could travel great distances in short amounts of time. This allowed people to expand their business and to reconnect with family. The definition doesn't get at that. And the last thing I want to identify about this is that this definition is open to debate. What does a small number of people mean? Oftentimes when people say go out to the car, they're not necessarily referring to a sedan these days. They could be referring to an SUV, for example. You could also argue, is it still a car if there's no passengers? What if it's carrying a dog? What if it's a clown car? You could debate this and debate this, but really, what's the purpose of that? We think that the true potential is so important, and focusing on all of the things that happen outside of that definition, the progress that has been made and where we're going, that is the exciting part about a conversation. And that's why we think this move from definition to potential is so crucial. We can now apply definition versus potential to social entrepreneurship. And if we look at the definition of social entrepreneurship, using business models, the selling of products or services to solve social problems, we can also look beyond what the definition says. It doesn't talk about how far the impacts could be. It doesn't talk about the types of impacts that you could have or the scale of those impacts. It doesn't talk about the different industries and the different business models that can be used to achieve impact. And it doesn't talk about how exciting this space could be. If we start talking about what is the potential of social entrepreneurship, we think we're just at the beginning of understanding what it could be. And what's really exciting about this space and the opportunities that exist in this space is that there's no one way to do social entrepreneurship. We're going to return to the issue of potential and the potential of social entrepreneurship. But for now, we just want to plant this seed to get you to ask yourself, what would you like to do with social entrepreneurship? If we look at the question of what people would like to do with social entrepreneurship, we've noticed 4 basic patterns. And at the core of these patterns, it always begins with the why, the mission, what social problem you're looking to tackle. And then they can do it through 4 different ways. I'm going to run through these 4 ways and then we'll dive deeper into each one. First is the what of the business model, what the customer uses the product for. Next is the how of the business model, your operations. Next is profits and what role they play. And finally, influence and how you use your influence. And like I said, we're going to dig into each one. So if we look at the what of your business model, what the customer uses the product for, here we're looking at the direct connection between what the customer uses the product for and your social model. And you can always think about, does the fact that you have a social model actually enhance the value to the customer? So does having that social piece actually make the product faster, longer lasting, more appealing to the customers? You can also think about how much money you can make from solving that customer problem. Next up, we have the operations, the how of the business model. And this relates to how you treat your employees and who you hire, but also environmental policies and practices that you have in place. And these how of the business model issues actually are applicable to every type of business, no matter what it does. And sometimes it can be difficult to tell if you're in a what of the business model or the how of the business model space. But really, you want to ask yourself, are the social pieces, is my social model allowing me to impact what the customer uses the product for? And if your answer is that you're not impacting how the customer is using that product, the social model is not having impact on that, then you're probably in the how space. Next, we have profits and how you use profits. And this has been a really interesting evolution over time, and this idea of how profits can be used to solve social problems. So basically, it started with philanthropy, which really said, after I get old and very rich, I'm going to use my wealth or profits to make the world a better place. And then people started to thinking about, well, why wait until I'm old and rich? I want to use my profits to solve social problems shortly after or while I actually make the money. And this has led to CSR, corporate social responsibility, and some models of social entrepreneurship, such as buy one, give one models, or donating a portion of your profit to a charity or cause. And that has actually led to even newer thinking. And this is often called the transformation of capitalism, which isn't about how or when you should use profits, but how much profit you should earn in the first place. And this comes to the idea of moving from extractive to regenerative capitalism. And it's one of the most exciting conversations of our time. And we're going to talk about it later and return to it. And finally, we see business models that aim to solve social problems through influence. And this is the newest one to us. It's actually one that we've just identified. Perhaps they're actually able to influence the government, other businesses, or the public based on the influence that they have and the power that they have in the market. And we find this tool to be really useful because there's been this huge rise of the number of social enterprises, and there's a lot of different models that you're seeing, and it can be really hard to keep track of them. And this is a good way to plug in various models. And we're going to actually now dig into this a bit further and talk through a number of examples and these different ways that business models can solve social problems. Three of the social enterprises and social entrepreneurs I'm going to use as examples here actually came from this documentary called The New Breed. And The New Breed talked about the rise of social entrepreneurship, and it introduced 3 organizations, and it followed them over 3 years. And this documentary mentioned that they all had different models, but it didn't actually dive into that, which got us thinking. So the first organization that was introduced was Bondfolk. And Bondfolk sells socks, and for every pair that's sold, they give a pair to individuals who are experiencing poverty and are homeless. The next was Borreo. And Borreo, their founders were really passionate about surfing. And so they actually focus on reclaiming abandoned fishing nets, which have a really high plastic content and can damage the ocean, and they create skateboards from them. And finally, No Supply, which is a clothing company that employs women from economically disadvantaged communities in developing countries and pays them fair wages. If we look at these 3 organizations, we can see that they aim to address their social problems and their whys in different ways. Borreo is a how model. So they create skateboards in an environmentally efficient way. We actually initially thought that maybe they were a what model. However, the fact that the skateboards aren't better and they don't fill the customer need better than those made of traditional plastics moves them away from a what model into more of a how model. So what I'm saying here is that skateboards that are built from abandoned fishing nets do not make for a bit better skateboard. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that they're not filling the customer need in a better way than traditional options. The next one is know and supply. So know and supply is also a how model. They use employment and fair wages as a means to address their mission. And bond folk is a profits model. So they sell socks, and the profit allows them to provide free socks to individuals who are experiencing homelessness. But what is so exciting about this social entrepreneurship space is that organizations aren't limited to having an impact in one way. Instead, what we actually see is that business models are evolving and changing and looking at different ways they can have impact, and you'll see them moving into other ways. So, for example, know and supply, beyond supplying jobs and fair wages, they've actually started to fund training programs for their employees that provides them with the skills to create their own businesses. And Borreo is now using a portion of its profits to offer workshops on the environment and the communities they work with. So they've gone from how models, and they're now looking at how do they use their profits as another way to address their why. And in fact, Bond Folk is also sort of looking at what they can do. So they mentioned that they'd actually like to scale to a point where they can have their factory in the United States and they can provide jobs to those experiencing poverty. Now, I haven't talked about the fourth way. I haven't talked about influence. And this is actually the newest one to us. And I want to talk about two examples of organizations that use their influence. So the first example is Novo Nordisk. And Novo Nordisk was one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies in the industry. And they produced insulin. And they realized they had a problem. And their problem is that their product, insulin, was not reaching the market that had the most difficulties and highest rates of type 2 diabetes. And in fact, 85% of those experiencing this condition were found in low to middle income countries around the world, and they couldn't afford to purchase the insulin that was necessary for their treatment. So they started to think about, okay, well, how do we get insulin to those who need it and the populations that most need it? And so they started to think about, could we do a cross-subsidization model where we can actually start to finance the insulin that is needed by these individuals? However, as they started to dig deeper into why they existed and what their why was and what their mission was, they realized it was not to produce insulin. But instead, they realized that their focus and their goal was to treat people with type 2 diabetes. And insulin is only one aspect to that. It's only one approach. So they actually started to work with medical practitioners and doctors and universities around the world to think about what is the most appropriate form to provide this diabetes treatments in different locations. As they worked through this and they worked with these communities, they realized that their purpose wasn't just to treat type 2 diabetes, but their goal should actually be to prevent it. And to prevent type 2 diabetes, the most important factor is actually lifestyle changes. And so they actually decided to go even further beyond the work that they were doing and decided to work with communities and NGOs to find ways to influence people's lifestyles around the world. And you might be thinking, hey, aren't you driving yourself out of business? But they actually found the exact opposite to be true. As a result, they were seen as being a more trustworthy supplier of insulin. And there are other products that they offered as well. They were deemed to be more trustworthy. They were seen as a trusted source for solutions because they demonstrated a real interest in addressing the needs of their customers, their patients, and their practitioners. The next example I want to talk about relates to the 2015 Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and this was signed by Governor Mike Pence in March 2015. And as soon as it was signed, there were a number of critics that called out this act because they worried that it would legally justify discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And so you actually saw a number of influential businesses speak out against this. Apple spoke out against it. A number of other software businesses spoke out against it. And then Angie's List, which is a home services website, actually announced that it would postpone a $40 million expansion into Indiana that would have provided more than 1,000 jobs because they were opposed to the passage of this bill. And they felt that they couldn't accept state subsidies for the company's expansion because of their disagreement with this act. A week later, the legislature passed the amendment, clarifying that this could not be used to defend discrimination against LGBTQ individuals. And a month later, the governor of Arkansas also signed a revised religious freedom law, following public pressure from the CEO of Walmart, who publicly requested that the government veto the original version of the bill on the grounds that it legitimized discrimination against LGBTQ people. So these are great examples of how organizations have been able to use their influence to move their mission and move their why and have impact. We think that this schematic and this understanding of social entrepreneurship will allow for a deeper understanding of how organizations are addressing their whys. And it really does confirm to us that there is no one way to have social impact. There is no one way to solve social problems. It's about the potential and making it what you can. We think this is a useful tool for you to actually run your own venture through. And it allows you to sort of look at the impact that you're having in ways that you can have impact, but it also identifies opportunities and potential that exists and areas that you could go to further your impact. So linked below this video, you'll see the worksheet that is associated with this that you can run your own venture through. However, before you do that, we're going to actually run through a few examples. And this will show you how organizations could use this activity. So the first example I'm going to go through is an article on Numi. And Numi is an organic tea business. And as you can see from the title, they're actually looking to move into the health and wellness space. And I want to show you just from one article how many different ways of impact are identified within this venture. So some of the quotes from this article are, they're an award-winning social enterprise, a founding B Corp member, and a leading purchaser of organic fair trade certified teas. They use plant-based tea wrappers. We still use 90% post-consumer waste paper cartons and soy-based inks. We have new products that cater to specific emotional and physical health needs, and we support community development projects. So we can actually run this example through the 4 ways business models can solve social problems. Here, we'll actually map Numi onto the 4 ways business models can solve social problems activity. And what you'll notice here is that in the boxes, we've actually made this more of an activity and substituted the definitions to questions that you can actually answer about each of the ways. So let's look at their what. What does your customer use the product for, and how does this address the social problem? Well, they have new tea products that cater to specific emotional and physical health needs. If you look at their operations, how do your operations address the social problem? They use a lot of environmental policies and practices. They use plant-based tea wrappers, 90% post-consumer waste paper cartons, and soy-based inks. And then the other place they talk about is their profits. So how do you use your profits to address the social problem? Well, they support community development projects. And not only does this allow us to more deeply understand how organizations are having impact and how they're solving social problems, but it might also highlight additional opportunities and potential for the venture. So for example, we didn't talk about influence at all. Is that a space where they think they can have impact, or a space that they want to focus on as they look at how they can solve social problems? I'm going to run through another example here, but I did want to encourage you to actually push pause and consider filling out the associated activity I talked about based on this article. And I'm going to link the article below. You have the worksheet, and you can actually take a stab at filling this out and then hear after the fact how I filled it out and how we went through the article. And the reason why I encourage you to do this is that we actually find running through examples to be an incredibly valuable experience. So here's a quick overview. This is an article from Forbes Online, and the title of the article was, "This Entrepreneur Fights Climate Change with Silky Soft Bamboo Sheets." Again, this is going to be one venture, one social entrepreneur, and this article talks about a number of different things. So first, it talks about creating bedding as soft as silk, as sustainable as hemp, as breathable as linen, but at the price of cotton. It talks about them using a closed loop system that recycles and reuses water. They use sustainable products in their office. They donate 1% of their sales towards environmental causes, and they offer their team a paid day off to volunteer towards environmental efforts. So, like we saw with Numi Tea, there's a lot going on. And I'm going to map this out, as I said, with using the activity, but once again, encouraging you to push pause and consider running through it yourself. We can actually run Ettitude through the 4 ways. And at the core, you have the mission. And this article identified their mission as being to combat or battle climate change. If we look at what does your customer use the product for and how does this address the social problem, well, they create bedding as soft as silk and as breathable as linen. And the reason why this is in the what box, the what of the business model box, is that because they use a method for making sustainable sheets that creates sheets that are both soft and breathable, they're actually enhancing the quality of that product and the quality of how the customer is going to use that product. If you look at their operations and how they address the social problem, well, they use a closed loop system that recycles the water and reuses it. They use sustainable products in their office, and they use for their profits, they donate 1% of sales towards environmental causes, and they also offer paid days off to volunteer towards environmental efforts. And what's really interesting about the 4 ways here is you can actually start looking at these connections. So for example, if you look at their why being climate change, you might ask yourself, well, is the connection between the why and the what, so creating bedding as soft as silk and breathable as linen, actually the best way to combat climate change? So is creating more environmentally friendly and sustainable, but also pricey sheets the way to go about addressing this issue? The 4 ways business models can solve social problems will allow you to start to have those types of conversations. While we were excited about having a deeper understanding of the different ways in which organizations can have impact on a social problem, and talking around this potential of this space and how there's no one way to do social entrepreneurship, we were plagued with an issue. And we're going to actually talk about this issue at the start of our next session. So please join us for part 2 of Rethinking Social Entrepreneurship.